Somewhere in the mountains near Kandahar, the story goes, American soldiers once found something that should not exist. A creature over 12 feet tall. Red hair. 6 fingers on each hand. A body so heavy it took a helicopter to lift it out of the valley. For almost 20 years, that story has traveled through radio shows, forums, veteran groups, and late-night YouTube recommendations, always told the same way. Soldiers vanish, a rescue team is sent in, something monstrous is waiting in a cave, and afterward, everyone involved is told to stay silent forever. Tonight, we are not going to retell that story as a mystery. We are going to trace it back to where it actually came from, follow it through 20 years of retellings, and show you exactly how a rumor became one of the most convincing legends of the modern era. What we found is stranger, in its own way, than a giant in a cave. To understand why this story spread so fast, you have to picture Afghanistan in the years right after 2001. American and Allied forces had just entered the country following the September 11th attacks, hunting for al-Qaeda and pushing back against the Taliban. The terrain was brutal. Jagged mountains, deep valleys, cave systems that had been used for shelter and smuggling for centuries, and vast stretches of land that almost no outsider had ever mapped in detail. Soldiers were sent into remote outposts for weeks at a time, often with limited communication back to base. It was exactly the kind of environment where strange stories take root, because it combined real danger, real isolation, and just enough unknown territory to make anything feel possible. That environment produced plenty of grim, true stories. It also produced folklore. And war has always produced folklore. In earlier generations, American troops in Vietnam swapped stories about a creature they called the rock ape, said to stalk jungle trails at night. Airmen in the Second World War blamed unexplained mechanical failures on invisible creatures they nicknamed gremlins, a term that eventually made its way into pop culture entirely detached from its origin. Soldiers have always told each other stories in the dark, partly to process fear, partly for entertainment, and partly because isolation and adrenaline make the line between rumor and memory blur. The Kandahar giant fits neatly into that tradition, except this one did not stay confined to barracks conversation. It went public, and it went public through a very specific person. The earliest documented telling of the story traces back to November of 2005, on the late-night radio program Coast to Coast AM, a show well known for covering paranormal claims, UFO sightings, and conspiracy theories. The guest that night was Stephen Quayle, an author and speaker who has spent decades promoting the idea that the Nephilim, the giants mentioned briefly in the book of Genesis, survived into the modern era and occasionally surface in remote parts of the world. On air, Quayle described a story he said had been passed to him by an anonymous Air Force pilot. According to that account, the pilot had personally helped move the body of a massive, red-haired, cannibalistic creature out of Afghanistan after it had wiped out a special forces team. No name, no rank, no unit, no verifiable record. Just a second-hand account, told on a radio program built around unverified claims. Quayle returned to the story again in 2008, this time bringing on a guest he introduced as the pilot himself, which gave the tale a second wave of attention among listeners already primed to believe in hidden histories and government secrecy. For close to a decade after that, the story mostly lived in a small corner of the internet, shared among people interested in cryptid sightings, biblical prophecy, and fringe military claims. That changed in 2016, when filmmaker and author L.A. Marzulli featured a dramatized version of the encounter in his documentary series about the paranormal and biblical mysteries. Marzulli brought in additional anonymous sources, including one man who claimed to have witnessed the firefight directly and another who offered second-hand details that didn't always match earlier versions. From there, the legend found new life across YouTube, Reddit threads, cryptid blogs, and eventually mainstream attention when narrators known for true crime and mystery storytelling picked it up and retold it to millions of viewers, each version adding a little more color, a few more specific details, a slightly taller creature. Here is where the investigation gets interesting, because when you actually try to run the story down the way a journalist or a fact-checking team would, almost nothing holds up. The Department of Defense has been asked directly about the alleged incident and has stated it has no record of any special forces unit encountering, fighting, or removing a giant creature from Kandahar province. There is no casualty report matching the description of a patrol wiped out inside a cave. There is no flight manifest for AC-130 or Chinook carrying an oversized, unidentified cargo out of Bagram airfield. There is no personnel file for a pilot who transported such a body to Qatar or onward to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a location that shows up constantly in American conspiracy folklore mostly because of its unrelated history as a storage site during the Roswell UFO investigation decades earlier. Fact-checking organizations that specialize in running down viral claims, including Snopes, have examined the story directly and classified it as unverified modern folklore rather than a documented event. One detail deserves special attention because it shows exactly how legends absorb real tragedy and reshape it. Several versions of the story name a soldier called Dan, said to have been killed by the creature's spear during the cave battle. When researchers actually cross-referenced military casualty records from Kandahar province around that period, they found a real service member, Sergeant First Class Daniel Romero, who died in the region during roughly the same window of the war. But the official cause of his death was an explosives-related accident that also killed several other soldiers, nothing involving a cave, a creature, or a spear. It's a sobering example of how these stories work. A real name, a real loss, and a real family get folded into a fictional narrative, sometimes without any of the storytellers realizing they've done it, simply because a name that sounds plausible lends the tale weight it wouldn't otherwise have. The physical evidence follows the same pattern. If you search for photographs of the alleged giant, you will find them. A body on a cargo platform, hands and feet spilling over the edges, soldiers standing nearby for scale. Reverse image searches and digital forensics on these photos, along with fact checks from outlets that specialize in verifying viral images, have consistently traced them back to digitally altered or entirely computer-generated artwork, not documentary photographs from Afghanistan. One image that recirculated widely in recent years, supposedly showing the creature from a 1923 encounter, was confirmed by fact-checkers to be an AI-generated or photoshopped picture with no connection to any real event, recent or historical. So if the Kandahar giant almost certainly never existed, why has the story survived for 20 years and only grown stronger with each retelling? Part of the answer is structural. The story is built almost perfectly to resist debunking. It always involves classified operations, so the absence of records becomes proof of a cover-up rather than proof the story is fictional. It always involves anonymous sources, so nobody can be held accountable for inaccuracies, and nobody can be definitively unmasked as having lied. And it always ends the same way, with everyone involved supposedly forced to sign documents preventing them from ever speaking publicly, which conveniently explains why no verified witness has ever come forward with their real name attached. There's also a deeper reason this particular legend resonates, and it has less to do with Afghanistan and more to do with an old human fascination. Giants show up again and again across cultures and centuries, from the Nephilim described briefly in Genesis, to the giant at the top of the beanstalk in English folklore, to legendary strongmen and warrior kings described in ancient texts around the world. Scholars who study the Genesis passage about the Nephilim have never reached full agreement on what the term originally meant. Some read it literally, as a description of unusually large or powerful beings. Others read it as a description of renowned warriors or leaders, men whose reputation for strength and achievement grew larger with each generation that retold their story, in much the same way modern legends grow. Either way, the idea that ancient giants once walked the earth, and that a few might still be out there in the most remote and unmapped corners of the planet, taps into something that predates the internet, predates radio, and predates the war in Afghanistan entirely. The Kandahar giant didn't invent that fascination. It just gave it a modern setting, a military backdrop, and enough technical detail about helicopters and cargo planes to feel plausible to an audience raised on stories of government secrecy. There's a related thread worth mentioning honestly, because ignoring it would be its own kind of dishonesty. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, American newspapers really did publish a surprising number of stories describing unusually large human skeletons unearthed by farmers, construction crews, or amateur archaeologists. Some of these reports claimed the remains were sent to institutions like the Smithsonian for further study, and many people online point to the fact that few of these specific remains were ever heard from again as evidence of a broader cover-up of ancient giants in North America. Historians who have looked into this pattern generally offer a much less dramatic explanation. 19th-century newspapers were frequently sensationalized, fact-checking standards were minimal by modern measures, and many giant skeleton stories that have been traced back to their source turn out to involve exaggerated measurements, mistaken animal bones, or outright fabrications printed to sell papers in a competitive news market. There is no confirmed case of the Smithsonian or any other major institution secretly destroying verified giant remains. But the pattern of these old stories shows exactly how the giant legend genre operates, on wartime rumor or 19th-century sensationalism alike. A dramatic claim, a vague or missing paper trail, and a public more than willing to fill in the gaps with suspicion. So here, honestly, is where the mystery lands. The Kandahar giant almost certainly never fought American soldiers in a cave in 2002. There is no military record of the event. The Department of Defense has denied it directly. The named casualty doesn't match the real cause of death of the soldier the story borrowed his name from, and the photographs commonly attached to the story are demonstrably altered or artificially generated rather than documentary evidence. What is real, and arguably more interesting than a literal giant, is the story of the story itself. A single radio appearance in 2005, built on one anonymous second-hand account, spread through fringe media, absorbed a real soldier's name and a real wartime tragedy along the way, picked up dramatic reenactments a decade later, and eventually reached an audience of millions who now regularly tell each other it might be true, precisely because the government would obviously deny something this big. That is not a small achievement for a story with zero verified sources. It says something honest about how legends actually spread in the internet era, not through hidden evidence slowly leaking out, but through repetition, borrowed authority, and an audience that finds a good mystery more satisfying than a confirmed dead end. It's also worth looking at why the version of this story that circulates today feels so much more convincing than the original 2005 broadcast. Compare the two side by side and the difference is obvious. Quayle's original telling was thin, an anonymous pilot, a vague description, no names, no specific dates beyond a rough year. The version most people encounter now is dense with specific, almost forensic detail. A precise height range. An exact weight, usually somewhere around 1,100 pounds. 6 fingers and 6 toes rather than a normal 5. Red hair rather than any other color. A named soldier. A named airfield. A named aircraft type. A named secondary base in the United States. None of that specificity came from a single verified source. It accumulated gradually, retelling by retelling, as different narrators, forums, and video creators each added a detail that made their version feel slightly more authoritative than the last one they'd heard. This is a well-documented pattern in the study of rumor and folklore, sometimes called accretion, where a story gains apparent credibility not because new evidence surfaces, but because repeated retelling makes vague claims sound increasingly precise. Precision feels like proof, even when the precision itself has no source behind it. The recovery and cover-up elements of the story deserve the same scrutiny, because they're doing a lot of narrative work. Every version of the tale ends with soldiers being separated, questioned individually, and pressured into signing documents that supposedly bar them from ever discussing what happened. It's a compelling image, and it mirrors real practices around classified operations, which is exactly why it feels plausible. But it's also a detail that can never be checked, by design. Nobody who signed such a document could confirm it without breaking it, according to the story's own internal logic, which means the claim is completely unfalsifiable. That's a common feature of legends that want to survive scrutiny. Build in an explanation for why no proof will ever surface, and the absence of proof stops being evidence against the story and instead becomes evidence that the cover-up is working. It's a closed loop, and closed loops are very hard to argue someone out of, because every counterargument gets absorbed as further confirmation. None of this means every person who has shared the Kandahar giant story online is being dishonest, or that everyone who finds it believable is gullible. Many veterans genuinely did serve in remote, isolated postings in Afghanistan, dealt with strange and unsettling experiences that never made it into an official report, and encountered a landscape and a set of local stories about danger in the mountains that felt entirely foreign to Western frameworks. That combination of real disorientation and a compelling, well-told legend is more than enough to make a story feel personally credible to someone, even without a single verified fact behind it. Fascination with the unexplained isn't a flaw in how people think. It's part of how curiosity works, and it's the same instinct that drives real scientific investigation into genuinely unexplained phenomena. The difference is simply whether that curiosity gets tested against evidence or allowed to settle into certainty without it. What makes the Kandahar giant worth understanding isn't really the creature at all. It's a case study in exactly how a modern legend is built, brick by brick, in an era when a single unverified radio segment can travel around the world and mutate into something that looks and feels like a documented historical event 20 years later. Trace almost any viral military cover-up story back far enough, and you tend to find the same ingredients. One anonymous source, a receptive audience already primed to distrust official denials, a retelling that adds detail with each pass, and a built-in explanation for why no hard evidence will ever surface. Recognizing that pattern doesn't require dismissing every unusual claim out of hand. It just means asking the same basic questions a journalist would ask of any story. Who is the original source? Can they be named? Does an independent record exist? And does the story survive contact with the actual official channels that would have generated a paper trail if the event were real? Run the Kandahar giant through those questions, and the mystery isn't really where the body went. It's how a single late-night radio appearance in 2005 became one of the most widely believed military legends of the last 2 decades. Whether or not you believe every cave in those mountains has been fully explored, the Kandahar giant, as told, is a legend rather than a documented event, and now you know exactly where it came from, who first told it, and why it never had anywhere to go but into folklore. If you found this breakdown interesting, let us know in the comments which mystery you want investigated next, and subscribe for more deep dives that separate what's actually documented from what just sounds like it should be true.